Paris is a city that appears to wear its history openly. Stone facades announce centuries, street names preserve vanished trades, plaques mark revolutions, occupations, fires, restorations. The surface suggests transparency, a place whose past has been catalogued, photographed, archived, argued over in universities and tourist guides, until very little should remain uncertain. That impression began to fracture in small ways. It started with elevation changes that made no sense, a sidewalk that dipped for half a block before rising again without explanation, a row of buildings whose ground floors sat noticeably higher than their neighbors, their entrances reached by steps that seemed added long after the walls behind them had hardened, sealed arches embedded in retaining walls, narrow staircases descending beneath cafes and metro entrances, blocked by welded gates and utility panels labeled with maintenance codes rather than dates. Individually, none of it was remarkable. Cities accumulate oddities. Pipes are rerouted, basements expand, streets are repaved again and again until their original contours blur. Paris, rebuilt and excavated for centuries, should contain thousands of such minor irregularities. What made these different was how often they clustered. Municipal diagrams showed one elevation. Street-level reality showed another. Renovation permits referenced substructures that no longer appeared on public maps. In a few cases, maintenance schematics hinted at vaulted spaces beneath narrow streets, shapes too broad for storm drains and too symmetrical for collapsed soil. Archivists did not describe them as mysteries. They described them as legacy infrastructure, historic load-bearing elements, redundant voids, terms that closed conversations rather than opened them. Commuters stepped over patched stone without slowing. Cafe owners stacked crates against curved masonry that predated their leases by centuries. City planners spoke of underground density in generalities, never in specifics. Nothing was hidden in a dramatic way. Nothing was highlighted either. The pattern sat in plain view, embedded in everyday movement, dismissed through familiarity. The deeper I looked at street gradients and foundation lines, the more Paris began to feel less like a city built layer by layer and more like one settled atop something older whose outline was no longer meant to be traced. Curiosity replaced casual acceptance, not because a conclusion had appeared, because the surface no longer felt complete. The surface irregularities led inevitably to paper. Municipal archives in Paris do not resemble forgotten basements. They are orderly, indexed, climate-controlled, designed to give the impression that nothing significant slips through their shelves. Street surveys stretch back centuries. Sewer expansions, foundation reinforcements, metro tunneling projects, wartime repairs, post-war reconstructions. Every generation added layers of ink to the same city. When those layers were laid side by side, the lines refused to cooperate. A cadastral map from the late 19th century showed a continuous block where a 20th century engineering plan marked a hollow. A sewer schematic curved sharply beneath a street that older property records insisted had solid ground below it. Load-bearing pylons appeared in maintenance diagrams with no corresponding approval files. Tunnels surfaced in one decade, vanished in the next, then reappeared under different labels, as though renamed rather than removed. Archivists were present only through margins, penciled corrections, question marks, rewritten legends. Surveyors left faint footprints in the form of crossed-out elevations and recalculated depths that never made it into finalized prints. The same neighborhoods kept recurring. What had begun as curiosity shifted, almost imperceptibly, into unease, not because a single document contradicted another. Cities accumulate errors because the contradictions were consistent. Absence began behaving less like oversight and more like a recurring architectural feature of the record itself. Paper eventually runs out of usefulness. Contradictions on maps can be attributed to revisions, clerical drift, redrawn property lines. Stone is less cooperative. The first underground span appeared beneath a street too narrow to justify anything elaborate. Access came through a maintenance shaft listed as drainage infrastructure. What emerged below did not resemble a sewer. A vaulted arch stretched across the void, its curve precise, its stones fitted so tightly that seams were visible only where mineral deposits had traced their outlines over time. Measurements complicated matters. The width exceeded what 19th-century drainage tunnels typically required. The rise of the arch suggested load-bearing ambitions far beyond channeling runoff. Support piers sat at intervals calculated for weight, not water. Their geometry implied traffic, pressure, repeated use. Reports from inspectors surfaced in technical language. No speculation, no commentary, only figures. Span length, keystone height, wall thickness. The vocabulary of routine assessment applied to something that did not feel routine at all. A second structure appeared 3 districts away, then a third. Each one surfaced precisely where older records grew vague, and newer plans became abstract, not absent. Exactly. Reclassified. The disturbance did not come from any single bridge, it came from their proportions. Sewer corridors did not require such height. Medieval passages were rarely this wide. These vaults suggested something designed to carry mass through confined spaces beneath a city that, officially, had no need for them. Documents had opened the door. Stone was now standing in the doorway, refusing to move. Scale was only the beginning. Stone carries fingerprints if you know where to look. Not literal ones, but habits. The angle at which blocks are dressed, the tolerance allowed between courses, the choice of bonding patterns, the chemistry of mortar. Every period leaves behind a quiet signature in its infrastructure, a set of preferences shaped by available tools, training, and time pressure. These bridges did not match their surroundings. Samples taken during routine stabilization projects describe binding agents that resisted moisture far better than nearby foundations of the same recorded era. Aggregate sizes varied from what municipal manuals prescribed for 19th century. Subterranean work. Tool marks along certain faces suggested cutting methods more commonly associated with monumental surface construction than with utilities buried beneath crowded streets. None of this was presented as remarkable in official paperwork. Classification labels absorbed the discrepancy. Heritage stonework, transitional infrastructure, legacy load-bearing systems, phrases that carried weight while refusing specificity. Public works departments appeared only through permits and filing codes. Preservation agencies surfaced as stamps in margins rather than explanations in reports. Each institution acknowledged the structures just long enough to reassign them to categories that required no follow-up. The emotional pressure did not come from a dramatic discovery. It came from accumulation. Each technical note widened the distance between what the bridges were and what they were supposed to be, labor-intensive arches buried beneath later strata, precision stonework supporting neighborhoods whose recorded builders never documented undertaking such projects, mortar formulations that outperformed surrounding walls officially constructed decades afterward. The question no longer centered on how large the structures were. It shifted to why something so deliberate had been folded into the city without ceremony, attribution, or surviving rationale. Stone, unlike maps, does not forget how it was made. It simply waits for someone to notice the contradiction. The depth introduced a different kind of problem. Maps and materials could be argued into ambiguity. Stratigraphy resisted interpretation in the same way stone resisted erosion. Excavation logs from unrelated infrastructure projects began to cluster around the same figures. 5 meters below a 20th century foundation, 8 beneath a 19th century sewer line, deeper still beneath retaining walls whose construction dates were otherwise well documented. The bridges occupied these lower bands consistently. Geological surveys described sediment profiles in careful sequence, compacted fill from Haussmann-era redevelopment, rubble layers associated with earlier demolition phases, beneath those undisturbed clay and gravel beds that predated modern urbanization entirely, and beneath them, the arches. Construction crews appeared only as initials attached to borehole diagrams. Core samples were catalogued, sealed, archived. No speculation followed. The data depth was recorded as a neutral variable. It did not feel neutral. The positioning suggested these spans had not merely been forgotten. They had been built first, then surrounded, then buried beneath generations of reconfiguration that never paused to annotate their presence. The accumulation of sediment did not read like centuries of gentle accretion. It read like episodes, discrete layers, interruptions. Burial began to resemble a process rather than an accident. The same corridors kept reappearing, now framed vertically instead of horizontally, their placement sliding backward in time with every meter removed from above. Suspicion did not announce itself. It settled quietly into the numbers. Stone had raised questions. Paper answered with absence. Requests for clarification moved through municipal channels slowly, acquiring reference numbers, routing stamps, department codes. The structures themselves were never denied. They appeared in maintenance schedules and liability assessments, in drainage modernization plans that treated them as fixed obstacles rather than historical artifacts. What did not appear were origins. Inspection files stopped mid-series. Archival catalogs listed sub-levels without corresponding construction permits. Survey annotations referred backward to documents that no longer sat in the boxes where they were supposed to live. The language stayed procedural. Legacy infrastructure, pre-existing conditions, non-attributable works. Bureaucrats entered the story only as initials on forms. Historians surfaced through disclaimers printed at the bottom of research requests. Municipal offices responded with paragraphs that acknowledged receipt while answering nothing. Silence developed shape. Each time a corridor reappeared on a work order, the associated paperwork thinned. Where engineering notes had once described stonework, later filings referenced previous assessments without attaching them. A citation loop formed, self-contained, endlessly referential, closed. The emotional shift was subtle. No rejection letters arrived, no arguments were made. The system did not resist inquiry. It absorbed it. Sites that had been defined through geometry and depth were now framed through filing systems that treated their presence as administrative background noise. The bridges persisted underground. Their paper shadows grew lighter with every decade. Patterns had been building in stone and sediment. They were now reproducing in ink. The pattern did not stop at the city limits. Once the dimensions and depths were catalogued in Paris, it became difficult not to notice how often similar descriptions surfaced elsewhere, embedded in unrelated reports from different countries, written in the same neutral register, filed under the same bureaucratic categories. Renovation briefs in Vienna referenced vaulted spans beneath narrow quarters. Transit upgrades in Prague documented reinforced arches at levels deeper than surrounding foundations. Sewer modernization projects in Lyon recorded voids too wide to be hydraulically efficient, too carefully dressed to be incidental. The language repeated pre-existing substructures, legacy works, unknown phase. Surveyors appeared only through diagrams. Restoration committees surfaced as approval stamps without commentary. The technical tone remained identical across borders, as if the same template were being reused to describe phenomena no one wished to frame historically. What unsettled me was not the presence of underground construction in old cities. That was expected. It was the consistency of what was being found. Oversized spans beneath modest streets. Masonry exceeding functional requirements. Depth profiles that placed the structures beneath later redevelopment cycles. Administrative gaps that followed the same rhythm of acknowledgement and deflection. Paris no longer felt exceptional. It felt representative. The earlier corridors and arches returned to focus, now reframed by their continental echoes. What had begun as a local irregularity was acquiring context, and context was making it heavier. A city can hide anomalies. A network suggests design. Function had always been the quiet stabilizer. Once dimensions, materials, and depth aligned, purpose usually followed. Drainage conduits required slope. Transit corridors demanded clearance calibrated to carts or rails. Medieval passages narrowed where stone became expensive, and widened only where traffic forced the issue. These structures resisted that logic. Traffic modeling based on known historical loads produced empty margins. The spans were too wide for pedestrian use, too tall for carts documented in municipal records, too reinforced for water management systems that rarely exerted lateral pressure. Load distribution suggested repeated movement, but of what scale remained unresolved. Every conventional category weakened under inspection. Sewers did not require such arches. Utility tunnels did not justify this masonry. Defensive works rarely hid beneath later civilian districts without written record. The calculations kept closing into uncertainty. Engineers existed only as abstractions in this process, hypothetical figures applied retroactively to designs they never signed. A single thought began to surface, then withdrew. What kind of traffic would have made this necessary? The destabilization came quietly. Confidence gave way to subtraction. Each rejected explanation left more space than the last, and the architecture continued to occupy it, patient, intact, unmoved by the absence of a story large enough to contain it. Inheritance rarely announces itself. Cities accumulate by layers, each generation resting its assumptions on whatever came before. Renovation permits described reinforcement rather than discovery. Adaptive reuse terminology softened the presence of arches that no longer fit contemporary circulation plans. Vaulted spans became support corridors. Load-bearing crossings were relabeled structural remnants. The language implied continuity without origin. Later foundations were poured directly against ancient stone. Steel braces hugged masonry, whose builders went unnamed. Transit conduits threaded through cavities that had not been designed for cables or pipes, yet tolerated them without complaint. Surveyors annotated around the arches rather than through them, drawing clean lines that curved politely to avoid disturbing whatever lay beneath. Developers entered the narrative as signatures at the bottom of retrofit plans. Regulators surfaced through conditional approvals that accepted the structures as fixed facts. Historians appeared only where footnotes ran out. What unsettled me was not that the city had reused what it found. It was how effortlessly it had done so. No ceremonies marked the integration. No debates lingered in council minutes. The bridges did not interrupt the record. They were absorbed into it, translated into the vocabulary of later centuries, until their strangeness dissolved into compliance. Stone persisted, memory adjusted. The corridors no longer felt like intrusions. They felt like inheritance, without a will. By the time the search circled back to the first vaulted spans, the streets above them felt altered, not visibly, not in any way a pedestrian could articulate. Cafes remained open. Traffic followed the same routes. Renovation scaffolds rose and vanished on predictable schedules. The city continued behaving like a city that had already explained itself. The bridges did not. They remained where they had always been, pressed into lower strata, carrying loads without attribution, threaded by later systems that depended on their strength while declining to describe it. Measurements still exceeded necessity. Mortar still resisted classification. Depth profiles still pushed them beyond the timelines that framed the neighborhoods resting overhead. The files remained partial. Permits still cited other permits. Inspection chains ended in ellipses. Survey drawings curved politely around voids that no document claimed responsibility for creating. No antagonists emerged from the paper trail. No hidden committees surfaced in the margins. Nothing dramatic resolved the discrepancy between what stood underground and what was supposed to have been built there. What persisted were the questions: why these dimensions? Why this precision? Why this depth? Why this silence? The arches carried weight every day, literal and otherwise, while the record above them stayed thin. They did not behave like curiosities. They behaved like infrastructure that had outlived its explanation, and that, more than any missing file or inconsistent map, refused to settle.